Homesteaders, gardeners, and cooks. My name is Jennifer. Welcome to Miles Away Farm. Thanks for joining me in my kitchen. Today I am experimenting in the kitchen with a canning recipe. This recipe comes from this canning cookbook from Ball. It's the Ball Complete Book of Home Preserving. And I don't use this canning book a lot. It has a lot of recipes in it for jams and chutneys and that kind of thing. It tends to be pretty traditional in terms of the way the recipes are written, so they tend to be pretty sugar heavy, and that's not my favorite thing. So I haven't used this a ton because that tends to be the general leaning. But I was intrigued by this particular recipe. It is called Carrot Cake in a Jar. And I originally saw this on the Becoming a Farm Girl YouTube channel. And I was intrigued by it not as something you would necessarily put on toast, but as an ingredient in other things. So I thought that was kind of an interesting idea. So I've had it flagged for a while. And then I just recently made a batch of Morning Glory Muffins. And I don't know if you've ever had Morning Glory Muffins, but the general ingredients are shredded carrot, shredded apple, pineapple, and coconut. So I'd never made them before. It's kind of a famous recipe, and they turned out really delicious. I happen to have some pineapple on hand, which is what inspired it. And I thought to myself, I looked up this carrot cake in a jar recipe, and it called for pears. And I thought, I bet we could make that with apples instead of pears. And then essentially what you have is a jar of Morning Glory muffin ingredients that are ready to go. And so my plan is to give this as Christmas gifts along with a pre-mixed pack of all the flour and leavenings and other things that go into this recipe and instructions. And then it's basically ready-made muffins, like a boxed muffin mix, but homemade with great ingredients. So that's kind of where I'm going with this. I've been making jams for a long time, and I make jams commercially on a small scale, and I always do lower pectin jams because I just can't in good conscience have a recipe that has more sugar than fruit by volume in it. It's just obscene. Basically, you're not making jam, you're making candy. And I'm not really interested in making candy. I have enough sugar in my diet as it is. And so the original recipe is written in a traditional way. It calls for 6.5 cups of sugar. So it's essentially candy. And I thought, because I work with low sugar pectins all the time, and I have some kind of background knowledge on how to convert recipes and what your percentages should be, I did a little back of the envelope calculations on this where I went with 50% fruit, 47% sugar, and 3% pectin. That's still quite high. It's still almost 50% sugar to 50% other stuff. However, it is considerably less than what the original recipe called for. I used just under 4 cups of sugar in this recipe, 3 3/4 cups of sugar, and the original recipe called for 6.5. So I did end up reducing the sugar in this recipe. Again, I have a background in this because I do it in my commercial kitchen, and I also have kind of taken a deep dive over the years into some of the food science. I am not compromising the safety of this recipe by switching the apples out with pears. Apples and pears have very similar pH, and apples actually lean a little bit more acidic than pears. So I feel very comfortable making that change. And then everything else in this recipe stays identical. And the sugar is not what's preserving this recipe. It's the heat and the pH that's preserving this recipe. And the sugar is there to kind of keep things from oxidizing, but it's not necessary to have that much sugar in this recipe. So so this is an adapted recipe with a little bit less sugar. And I think I could have done even less. I wasn't sure. There's some chemistry with sugar and acid and fruit where you have to be careful or things don't chemically gel the way they're supposed to. And so I was a little worried about backing off even more on the sugar in this. And so I went with a 50-50 mix of basically of sugar and fruit, but I think I could have backed off a little bit more. So next time I make this, I will try it that way. But kind of exciting, kind of fun. So I'm using homegrown apples. We have 4 apple trees on the property, and the one surprisingly that does the best is the Honeycrisp. Honeycrisp are kind of notorious for being difficult to grow because they need more calcium in the soil, but for whatever reason our Honeycrisp does really well. And so I have Honeycrisp apples here. Those have been in our walk-in cooler for probably a month and a half. And then I have homegrown carrots. And I specifically waited to harvest these carrots until after we had a frost because it really does sweeten them up and makes them just absolutely delicious. So I have homegrown carrots. And then the pineapple that I'm using in this recipe is store-bought pineapple, but I actually had canned it. I had bought some pineapple. I was going to do a turkey al pastor for Thanksgiving. We ended up doing a whole bunch of other stuff. And so I ended up not doing a turkey this year. So I had 2 pineapples sitting on my counter, one that I bought for the recipe, and then a second one because I saw it and it was on a sale for a really good price. And so I had 2 pineapples sitting there that I needed to do something with, and so I decided to can them. And so I ended up with 4 pint jars of home canned pineapple, and it turns out that 1 jar of home canned pineapple was just perfect for this recipe. So yeah, we've got some really lovely ingredients, and I did add a little bit of pecans right at the end, so this is technically a conserve instead of a jam because we've added nuts to it, but I'm hoping it's going to be delicious and a really easy, like, open and go Morning Glory muffin mix for Christmas. It's a great experiment. Let's get started. So I'm going to need 1.5 cups of peeled and grated carrot, and the carrots that I'm growing are Scarlet Nantas, and I've been growing them for a lot of years. I did a side-by-side test one year of a bunch of different carrot varieties, and these were by far my favorite. I really like them a lot. And when you're measuring something like this, I pack it down in the container. So I'm not doing fluffy, I'm doing packed. So 1.5 cups of carrot. I also need 1.5 cups of finely chopped apples, and you do need to peel them. One, just because texture-wise, apple peels once they're cooked are not all that pleasant, and also just because with a tested jam recipe like this, they called for peeled apples. And because these are Honeycrisp apples, they are not going to break down a lot in the cooking, and I actually kind of prefer it that way. So another 1.5 cups of Honeycrisp. And then here is my pint of home canned pineapple. And I wasn't sure if this was going to work out to be the right amount. So I was a little fiddly here, but it turned out to be just the perfect amount for what I needed. So draining out the liquid, and the liquid in this is a little bit of sugar syrup, and then dicing up our pineapple. And I'm looking for 1 3/4 cups of diced canned pineapple, including the juice. And so basically I just diced all of the pineapple and then I added juice to equal 1 3/4 cups. And I had a little bit of juice left over, and we ended up just throwing it into some apple cider cranberry punch that we were making for a holiday get together, so it didn't go to waste. And if you guys are interested in learning how to convert a full sugar recipe to a lower sugar recipe, let me know in the comments and I can show you how the math works on that. You do need to work by weight when you do that. And then all of that goes into a cold, heavy-bottomed pot. And I can't emphasize this enough. Don't start your heat until you add your pectin. So 3 tablespoons of lemon juice. This is bottled lemon juice, and it is really critical to this recipe because those carrots are not naturally acidic. Need a teaspoon cinnamon, 1/2 teaspoon of nutmeg, 1/2 teaspoon of cloves. This is the pectin, which is a 1 3/4 ounce box mixed with 1 3/4 ounces of sugar. And mixing those two together just keeps that pectin from clumping up. It just kind of spreads it out a little bit so that it doesn't clump. And then this pot and all the ingredients are cold. If you add pectin to hot fruit or hot syrup, it tends to clump up. And I have learned that lesson the hard way more than once. So start with a cold pan, get everything thoroughly mixed in and dispersed, and then get your heat going. And we're going to cook this, we're going to bring it up to a low simmer, and then we are going to simmer this for 20 minutes. And that's just going to soften up the carrots, soften up the apple, get everything cooked together. And then before you add the rest of the sugar, you want this to be at a nice boil where it doesn't stop boiling when you stir it. And then we're going to add in our sugar, and I like to add it slowly and keep stirring. If you don't, you end up with a big clump of sugar that hasn't quite dissolved, and you kind of have to fiddle with it in the pot. And so adding it slowly and stirring it in keeps you from having big clumps of sugar that you then have to fight later. And this is going to immediately drop the temperature of your jam quite a bit. And it's also going to raise the boiling point because the sugar syrup is a higher boiling point than just liquid fruit juice. And so we're going to stir all of that sugar until it's completely dissolved, and then bring this back up to a rolling boil. And you want it to be where it's boiling even as you stir it. So you shouldn't be able to stir down that boil. It's just starting to boil here. You boil it that way for about 1 minute. And this is specific to a low sugar pectin, and it's specific to the powdered pectin that I'm using. Your mileage may vary depending on the pectin that you're using, so be sure to read the instructions on your specific pectin because it will vary depending on what you're using. I didn't happen to have a ladle today. I had gone to a party and put it in some punch and forgot to pick it up, and so it took a while to get it back. So I'm doing this the tedious way with a big spoon. And interestingly, this recipe came out to be exactly 6 cups, which is what it said it was going to make. And it's unusual for a ball canning recipe to actually make exactly what it says. Usually it ends up making more and you end up having to go find another jar. Wipe your rims, lids on finger tight, not tighter than that, and then into water bath canner. And you want your water to be 1 inch above the canning jars. So I ended up having to add a little bit of water to the pot and then bring it to a boil. And then you start your timer once that water has come to a full rolling boil, not before. So now we're at a full rolling boil, and this gets processed for just 10 minutes. And then I like to turn the pot off and let it sit with the lid open for 5 minutes before I pull the jars out. It just gives you a slightly better seal on your jar lids. Not absolutely necessary, but a good idea. And there's our jam right out of the canner. And this is what it looked like the next day. So a nice set. You can see it's got a little bit of liquid to it, so it's not completely gelled, but a very nice set. And I think it's going to be delicious in muffins and other things. I think it would also be really good in oatmeal. So give this recipe a try, you guys. It's a fun experiment. Thanks for watching, Tribe. If you like this kind of content, give me a thumbs up, subscribe, leave me a comment, and share. I have new content coming out every week.